Well, g'day everyone, live from Quinola Lakes near Malanda. And I have Scot Devlin from Creation Ministries with us. Scott, now you've moved to Australia. I understand that you grew up in the UK. So I'd like to ask a little bit about that, if you can introduce yourself in that way, but also your degree. But probably most importantly, how you came to Christ and a little bit of your testimony in that regard.
Yeah, sure. It's good to be on with you, Graham, and everyone else, whoever else is listening in. So myself and my wife moved here to Brisbane, Australia from the UK about 6 years ago. And we've now got two kids that have been born here, one on the way. So it's been a busy 6 years. And so my background, I studied geophysics. I worked as a geophysicist for a while. And then you wanted to also know my testimony, how I came to Christ. Was that right?
Yes. Yes.
So I grew up essentially in a non-Christian environment. My father's not a believer, atheist, agnostic, but my grandparents in Australia, actually, they were Christians, and they did tell on a trip to Australia. So I grew up in the UK, but my mother is Australian, and so on one trip to Australia when I was very young, about 5, my grandma told me about Jesus, and she even told me about a prayer of salvation, and I think I did that at that time, but I had no Christian context growing up, pretty much. I went to a normal secular school, and I was told, religions are good ideas, but science is really truth. And so, but all that time, I thought there must be something more. There has to be something more. It doesn't. We don't have sufficient explanations for what I can see. We don't have sufficient explanations for life. And so I thought that growing up as a young boy and as a teenager, but I didn't have the answers. I had questions. What about other religions? What about suffering? I had these kind of questions, but I never had opportunity to address them, and I never saw anyone effectively living out the Christian life. I think there were maybe a couple of Christians in my school, but I only found that out afterwards. So it was only really at the age of 18, and I traveled. I did a gap year. I was traveling around the world, and I spent 4 months living in Fiji. And whilst I was there, they all go to church there. So I went to church with them. I'm tall, skinny, and white, and they're all short and black. So I stood out a bit like a sore thumb. So I thought, I'll fit in as much as I can. They go to church, I'll go to church. And I went to, as I was in church, as they were worshiping Jesus, I encountered the presence of God. And I didn't believe in anything supernatural. I didn't believe if someone told me about ghost stories or anything like that, I just wouldn't believe it. I was like, only the natural exists. So I had a pure philosophy of naturalism. I didn't realize that at the time, but I just thought, well, it doesn't make sense for there to be anything supernatural. So for me to have this encounter with God, and that happens each Sunday, every time they worship Jesus, really can convince me that, hang on, because I looked around and I analyzed the environment. I got quite an analytical brain, and as I was analyzing the environment, I did it one Sunday, then the next Sunday, then the next Sunday, and by the fourth Sunday, I couldn't give any natural explanation to this encounter that I was having with a real living God. And I said, okay, well, he must be real. And then suddenly that made sense. Well, there's 2 billion people out of the 6 billion people in the world, as it was then. I think we're at 7.5 billion now. So a third of the world say they're Christian of some sort. And I just thought it was tradition. And of course, for a lot, it probably is. But you can't have 2 billion people after 2,000 years all believing in this one Jewish man, Jesus, as Messiah and King, and worshipping him without there being some more reality into this. So yeah, that convinced me that, and I guess no one told me what to do then, but I just made a decision that I'm going to follow you, God. You're real. I'm going to follow you, Jesus. And then I started reading the Bible, and God just spoke to me through it, and I started finding out. It was like this whole hidden world, Graham, that I'd never known. Just the amount of good evidence for the Bible. You look at
Yes.
the prophecies that have come true, and of course, I'd listened to the media, and the Bible's been corrupted at different times. But then, actually, when you look into it, you find that textual criticism is this amazing tool that tells us we're pretty much holding the original in our hands now, and all these things just made so much sense as I started to look into them. But it had been hidden from me, and then I got involved in church and enjoyed fellowship and saw people loving each other genuinely without need for something in return. And I thought, wow, this is like this whole secret world that I did not know as a teenager, as a young boy growing up. I did not know that Jesus was real. He really wanted to meet me today. The Bible was real, and there was great evidence for Jesus being the Son of God, the King, the Messiah, being God himself incarnate. I just hadn't been exposed to any of this. So it was a great surprise to me at 18 years old and then 19, 20, kind of learning these things, that this was all just a totally hidden world from me. So yeah, it's cool that we're going to do this over YouTube. And I pray that maybe there's someone randomly joins in that
Yep.
might be a young person
Yep.
like me, maybe at school in a secular place. And
Yep.
I find that when I speak to young people today, even occasionally I meet some young people. I've done a bit of work in schools, and especially state schools. They don't know. I mean, maybe they've heard of Jesus. They don't know what communion is. They don't know what Easter means. They don't know what Christmas means. They don't know what Jesus' death means. They have no idea at all. And so, yes, it's an honor to be here and be able to do this.
And they don't even know that this is the year of 2021. Since when?
Yeah.
Why do we number this year as 2021? Yes.
Yeah.
So Scott, would you mind opening us in prayer? And I also want to ask you, what is a geophysicist? What does a geophysicist do? Whichever one of those questions you want to answer, the easiest one to answer. So I'll leave it up to you. Do you want to pray first or answer that first? And then we can get into the presentation.
Yeah, I'll answer and then we'll get to the presentation. So geophysics. So physics, I guess most people understand that. And then geo is Earth. So it's Earth physics, basically, how the Earth works. So a lot of geophysicists, if they go into the academic realm, they'll be studying things like earthquakes and volcanoes, plate tectonics, how the Earth works, geomagnetism, and things like that. But I'd say the majority of graduates that study geophysics will go into the oil industry, and we use sound waves to see what's underneath the ground. And that's the main application. There's other techniques, geomagnetic techniques, resistivity, electrical conductivity tests. And the idea is we're trying to see what's under the ground. So that's the main commercial application of geophysics, is to see what's under the ground. And of course, what's a very valuable thing underground is oil. So hence why the most money spent on looking under the ground in general is for oil. And so that's why a lot of people are going to the oil industry. So yeah, I found that really fascinating. But more recently, I've started studying a bit of physics and cosmology, because that's obviously a really important area for creation science and the creation evolution debate. So yeah, I'll open in prayer, Graham.
Amen.
So Father, I just want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you that we're here today. Thank you for the technology enables us to do this. Lord, we ask that you'd be with us, God, that people would tune in with open hearts. Father, I ask that questions would come in freely, God, and there might be, even as I was mentioning earlier, there might even be young people joining in that have not heard the significance of what Jesus has done for them. Father, we commit this time into your hands. May you use it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Exciting. Let's go.
Cool. So I've got a presentation for you, Graham, that is we call it a relevance talk. So I work for Creation Ministries International. We've got that big banner up there, and I've been working for them for 3 years. And we talk in schools, we talk in universities when they allow us, we talk in mainly churches. So a lot of the time we're talking in churches, and not all of them allow us in, actually. But the talk that we usually give to churches, we call a relevance talk. And so this is my relevance talk that I'm going to give you. And so it's going to talk we're just going to brush over a little bit of the scientific concepts, and we're going to talk about historical and experimental science, and mainly what the implications are for Bible believing Christians of trying to take in an evolutionary point of view or a creation point of view, trying to take the Bible as history, or try and mythologize Genesis 1 to 3. What are the effects of that? So that's the kind of things I'm going to be talking about. So I'm used to giving this in a church. It's the first time I've given it here. But the first question I want to ask you is, if I did ask you for 2 minutes of your time to show you that man and dinosaur live together, what would you say? Would you
What
reckon,
would I
Graham?
say?
Yeah, what do you reckon? Would you let me?
Oh,
Would you give me 2 minutes of your time to show you that man and dinosaur live together?
absolutely. I already believe it. I'd love to. I'd love to see what evidence you want to give me. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so and the first time I asked someone that question, and if you've never heard about this, there is fantastic evidence that man and dinosaur live together, and that might be shocking to you if you've never looked into, if you don't know of our ministry, you don't know of Answers in Genesis, or these other creationist ministries and organizations that talk about this stuff. You would probably think that is crazy, but there's amazing evidence for it. So the first time I asked someone that question was here outside of Creation Ministries evangelism tent in Redlands, Queensland. I was, some of those in Queensland, you might recognize the Redlands Easter Festival. Now, I don't think it's been on the last 2 years because of coronavirus, but I think this is in 2018, 2019 maybe. So when I asked this question, I was really surprised at how many gospel conversations I had after discussing dinosaurs.
Yep.
Now, at this time, I was new to the creation evolution debate, which is really strange because I've been a Christian for over 15 years at the time. And in that time, I'd studied science and I worked as a scientist, as I was explaining. I worked as a geophysicist. The problem was that I'd been told that this was an issue to avoid. I was told that questioning evolution would hinder evangelism and not help. And I got told that especially when I was at university. So I just evangelized with other techniques without using creation evolution. So this is why I was amazed at this tent. I got to talk about Jesus straight after talking about dinosaurs.
Yep. The truth is the opposite.
Say that again.
The truth is the opposite. Creation actually aids evangelism. Creation
exactly,
talk and being able to provide the evidence is the exact opposite of what we get. These are lies that it hinders.
But as I was saying, for 15 years, I believed that lie. I hadn't looked into it. Now I took the Bible as truth for myself, and if someone asked me what was my position on these issues, I'd say, look, the Bible is true, but I wouldn't talk about it much further than there. So I didn't. I just didn't know about how fruitful it could be. So this is why it's so surprising to me. So shortly after this photo was taken here that you can see, I had an encounter with 3 other people, and this chat I had with these 3 other people greatly changed the way I relate to unbelievers. And that's what I want to share with you to start with. So one of the group of the 3, not these 3, the next, or some 3 people I talked to later, one of the group was angry with God. And maybe you've met someone like that. Have you met someone like that before, Graham? Someone angry with God?
Indeed, there's a person in a suicide discussion group who came on angry with God. Wow. And it's God's fault that they had suicidal thoughts. I haven't been able to engage them further than that yet, but yes, I regularly find people, especially online, who are angry with God.
Yes, yeah, I imagine you would find more than others. When I ask this question at a church, I would say 70 to 80% of people put their hands up. But I shouldn't have even doubted with an online ministry. I'm sure that's where people are more free with actually what they're believing.
Yeah.
And because, it's a bit more impersonal, we can talk a bit more freely, which has its advantages. So generally, I find that it's not that pleasant to talk with such a person about God. And I mean, generally, that's what people tell me anyway. But I feel like I'm strange because I enjoy the challenge. I enjoy that kind of challenge. And especially if they're willing to debate and willing to talk and be open, I love that kind of challenge. But one of the negative things I find about myself is that I'm often insensitive towards their reasons. So the person that's angry with God, their reasons why they're angry with God. I'm often challenging them in debate, but I'm not sensitive to their reasons. But the conversation I had at this tent was really illuminating for me, because the lady, so there was a lady, a man, and I think it was that man's mother, these three people. But the lady who was angry with God, she was very open. She told me that her issue with God was suffering. She'd experienced suffering, and she'd observed others suffering. Like many people, she was asking God, why have you created all this death and suffering? Now, the biblical answer is really straightforward. It's God's good creation and man's fall. God created the world to be very good, and it was man's sin that brought about death and suffering. Now, I'd given this answer before, but at this tent, with my newfound confidence in the Bible's history, I was able to clearly explain the origin of suffering by drawing 3 circles. And the first I drew was like this. Now, my drawing is not quite as good as this picture. CMI graphic artists are much better than me at drawing. But I said, I drew a picture, just a rough circle with some thorns on it. And I said, this is how you see the world. Survival of the fittest, death, disease, and suffering. And I said to her, I agree with your conclusions. The world is broken. However, this was not how God created it. God created a very good world without thorns, thistles, suffering, death, and disease. In fact, Adam's sin, it was a consequence of Adam's sin. That was an intrusion into God's very good world. Now, to my surprise, she seemed to change her attitude immediately, and she and the other 2 people with her all received prayer. There was a bit of conversation between that. But one of them, as I was praying for them, was even moved to tears. And this was all because of a very simple answer to the question of suffering. Now, why had I not given this answer before? And how come today's church focuses on the how and not the why of suffering?
Yes.
I've heard a lot of messages about how to suffer, and they're good and they're important. We're going to suffer in this world as Christians. We were talking about that yesterday on the phone, Graham. Jesus promised us suffering. And we need to know how to suffer well, because we get to share in his suffering, we get to share in his glory. But why do we not talk about the why? Why do we suffer in the first place? Now, the reason is because this is the prevailing view. This is the prevailing naturalistic view that we're told. This is what most people are told to believe. Just this picture here, not the top left one. I took that out. That they believe, and we're told to believe, I was told to believe, the earth has always been a harsh place for billions of years where only the fittest survive. The question is, how can God be good if this is true? How could a good God create a world like this? Now, this origin story is not just in our schools, but it's also on our TV screens. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. And since being here for 6 years, I've just been back once. It was about 2-3 years ago for Christmas. Went for a couple of months. And I don't usually watch TV, but being back home, we don't have a TV here, but being back home, I had opportunity to watch TV. And there was this series on the BBC. You might have heard that, the British Broadcasting Corporation. 2018, there you go. And it was called, there was a series, and there was 3 shows. What Makes Me Me, What Makes Me Human, Where Do I Come From? And I watched the one, I watched this one. Which one was it? What Makes Me Human, What Makes Me Me? Yeah, I watched the Where Do I Come From, this one. So that's the one I want to introduce to you. So I watched this, and this is a show, and it's presented to a lot of kids, and there's about 100 in the audience, or maybe 200 in the audience, but there's probably millions worldwide that watch this on the TV afterwards. Now, the presenter is this lady here, Alice Roberts. Now, she is the professor of public engagement in science at the University of Birmingham. But what is not mentioned during the show, but you can be found by a quick Google search of her name, is that she is also the president of Humanists UK. They campaign for a secular state, and they also campaign for the ending of faith-based schools. So she's the one that's given the opportunity to present to 200 children in the lecture theatre and possibly millions over the TV screens. And I'll just show you how the show.
And push her religion.
Exactly, but in the guise of this is science, guys.
Yeah.
So let's have a look at the start of the
In
show.
here, I have some of your cousins. They are tiny bioluminescent single-celled organisms, and when I shake them, they glow. They spend their time floating around and glowing. You spend your time going to school and seeing your friends, and yet we are related. We're both part of the great tree of life on this planet. But where do we fit into this tree of life?
So our kids are told at the start of the show that their cousins are bioluminescent single-celled organisms and that we're related to these single-celled organisms by the great tree of life. And the question is posed, where is our position as humans on the great tree of life? Obviously, the question is to help answer the show's title, Where Do I Come From? And as I play the introduction, this is just a 1-minute clip or less, I want you to look at the kids' faces.
Welcome to the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures. I'm Professor Alice Roberts, and over the course of these 3 lectures, we are going to find out who we really are. And we're going to do that by comparing ourselves with each other, with earlier types of humans, and even with other animals as well.
So what we sow into our kids' minds as truth is fundamental to their formation. And of course, when you're comparing yourself to other animals, this is what they mean. We have bones and we have forelimbs, hind limbs, just like a horse, just like a cat, just like a dog. And of course, they're making the assumption that there is a common ancestor because we have common parts. But we know as Christians, actually, the truth that why we look similar to other things in our environment is because we have a common designer. So that's a big difference there on the presuppositions. But this is how the show ends. So they have the great tree of life, the Darwinian tree of life. They've got the single-celled amoebas on the top, and then more complex organisms as you go down, and the tree gets bigger. So this is the last clip I'll play. The show concludes like this.
Pathways leads to us, and we come all the way down to humans at the bottom here. This puts us in our place. It shows us where we come from, and we are not the pinnacle of evolution.
Amazing that she seems happy about that. Now, you might not be the pinnacle of evolution, but I want to tell you, if you're listening to this stream and you're breathing and you're alive, you are the pinnacle of creation, because God made you in his image on the 6th day of creation.
Yes.
Now, this same kind of program and ideas, it can be found on our Australian TV channels as well. It's not just in Britain. It's found in our universities, in nature documentaries, national parks, newspapers. The evolution story now takes up whole wings of museums, and most foundationally is being taught in all schools to all students. The effects are evident. When I say all schools, praise God for these some private Christian schools that actually they still teach evolution, which is good, and we encourage that. But they teach
the truth.
Well.
They teach the truth about it.
And maybe this is a bit of an aside from the presentation, Graham, but that's a really important thing. If someone's sitting there listening to this as a Christian, we encourage all people to learn evolution, because you're going to encounter it. If you're not prepared for it, then that's a hindrance. So if you're in school, learn evolution, but also plug into creation.com, learn about creation.
And just one more comment. Most of my audience is American. So what Scott's saying applies to America as well. Almost every university in America and nearly every educational institution, most of the churches in America, this is slowly going global from the Western world out to the rest of the world as well. Thankfully, God has pockets where that is not true. Especially the persecuted church, as we like to call it.
Yeah. So it's actually interesting. Sorry, this is an aside as well, but it's kind of interesting. One of those pockets is Turkey. Obviously, that's the Islamic world, but I've heard various reports there where they're not teaching evolution in schools and they want to teach a more creation-based approach. We even CMI, we've actually been approached by some Islamic organizations before and said, can we work with you because we like what you're doing. And we say, wow. As long as Jesus is the Christ, we can work for you. Like this is kind of how we work. So we didn't end up working together. But yeah, it's interesting that kind of a more theocratic government is more aggressive against evolution.
So when I'm talking, there seems to be an echo, so I might have to mute you. Oh no, it's still happening. So for some reason there's an echo. I won't be able to talk at the moment.
I can't hear that echo. So
the people listening are.
Okay. So Graham, I've got one more question before you go on mute. Do you know a person who grew up in a Christian family and they went to church, but they've since dropped out of church?
Yes, I do know some.
Yeah. And often when I ask this question in churches, I get about 60%, sometimes 70% of people will raise their hands and say, yep, I know someone in my family, a friend, they've grown up in church, but they've since dropped out of church. Now that's quite a high percentage. And actually the statistics on that kind of back it up. So the Americans might recognize the Barna Institute. It's a Christian-based research institute in America. And now I've got statistics for Australia in this presentation, but actually they usually release statistics. So they're a Christian polling organization, and they usually release statistics in America for America. But for the first time, about 2 years ago, they released statistics for this. So they did surveys across the world in many different countries across the world. And they did a study, but their study was specifically on millennials, 18 to 35-year-olds. And this is the study, you can get it, it's called The Connected Generation. And I was lucky enough to go along to, anyway, so this is what they found out. 18 to 35-year-olds, they found that 71% meet their dropout criteria. And that's roughly saying this: they used to be a regular church attender, now they don't attend church at all. So that's how they get that figure. So 71% of our young people that have grown up in church drop out. And it's a huge kind of scary figure, but you've probably heard figures like that before. But the interesting thing about this was they went on to ask the people a question, and they asked them multiple questions, but one of the questions they asked was this: what makes you doubt things of a spiritual nature the most? So it's what makes you doubt things of a spiritual nature the most. And what was the answer? Number one answer was science. And so that's true for Australia and New Zealand. It wasn't true for all the countries in the world, actually, but if it wasn't first, it was second. Second for Australia was hypocrisy in the church. Third was human suffering. And we talked about human suffering earlier, right, with the lady at the tent. Fourth is conflict in the world. And fifth is history. And of course, the creation evolution issue is to do with history. So I'll show you, I'll pull the graph up here. So you can see that, this is Australia, this top blue line, and science was number one to this question. And then you got hypocrisy in the church. So I think New Zealand is green. I think the blue one is the world. So blue science comes second, and it's hypocrisy in the church comes first. But my point is, science is here, history is here, human suffering is here. These are some of the reasons our young people leave the church. So this is why this issue we're talking about is really important. And often I speak to pastors and they say, it's a bit of a side issue. We can't have you talk. I say, look, this is really important for our young people. They say, I don't think it is. But really the polling and the evidence says it is. It says these young people, their biggest issues are hypocrisy in the church, science, human suffering, conflict in the world, and history. And that's true across the world, as well as in Australia and New Zealand.
So I just wanted to make a quick comment. I think I figured
go
out
on.
what the audio is. I need to mute your shared screen audio. And that seems to be where the echo is coming from, and that seems to be fixed now. But I just want to make a quick comment on science. You mentioned science earlier, that she's a professor of science.
Yes.
And again, here, science is the reason, science so-called, is the reason that people give to not believe in God. But it's not science. It's actually naturalism. So
Correct.
it's a form of science that strips away the foundational basis for how we actually can have science. I love to talk about this. If God doesn't exist, if science is purely naturalism, then you can't do science, because God
Mhm.
is the source of logic. And
Mhm.
science relies on logic. If naturalism is all that exists, then logic cannot exist, because it's just
Mhm.
chemicals bouncing around. And those chemicals will just do what chemicals do. There's no logic, there's no choices, there's no thinking, there's no reasoning that can go on. Chemicals don't reason, they just do what they do. So
Mhm.
logic can't exist. So science can't exist.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, it is very
um,
interesting. Yeah, we've got because we can logically form things in our brain, we can do science and we can conceive of experiments and test them and see that they work. That's a really good point. Um, Also, the reason science can even has flourished in the world in history. I mean, really it flourished in the medieval age, and then we had, the last 200 years, we've had massive advancements in science. Is all based on the Christian worldview of a consistent creator God. It's not based on the capricious Hindu gods that do one thing one time, one thing the next time. We've got a consistent creator God, and therefore, when we do
amen.
experiments in the world, we can expect to get a consistent answer back, and that's the whole scientific method, which I'll
Do,
mention in a bit, actually.
do you
Um,
have a presentation on this, Scott? because I
uh,
love digging into this stuff, the philosophical underpinnings for God being the source of everything. So
yeah,
nothing is possible. If God doesn't exist, nothing is possible. We couldn't be here. The fact that we exist proves that there is a God.
yeah. There's a few different arguments. We've mentioned three different arguments there, which are really like I was talking about how we can do science. You're talking about
Mm,
us, uh, just even the nature of creation pointing to evidence of God, and then there's the logic and human reasoning. The fact that we can reason is not a product of evolution or product of naturalism. But yeah, it's interesting stuff. I don't have a
um,
specific presentation, but there is some great articles. There's a great article on
yeah,
creation.com about a
yeah.
few of
There's
these things.
lots of good stuff out there.
Mm.
One other quick comment: if you do need sound again, you'll have remind me, or you'll have to turn your
Oh yeah,
audio in StreamYard back on for your screen
I think
sharing.
I think I'm good now. Actually, it was just those first few videos I wanted to show.
Right.
Um,
Good.
so so I was talking about the Barner Institute, and this guy's the president. His name's David Kinnaman, and he came to Australia. He traveled around the world recently. It was a few years ago, and I went to go and see him release. So he was releasing that booklet that I was showing, which was the study on Australia. And I went to see him talk, and there was two phrases when he talked that I thought, that's gold. I've got to take these away, so I want to share them with you. And he said this. So he admitted himself. He said, "Look, I'm not a theologian. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a pollster." And he oversaw the interviewing of thousands of young people. So it's over 1,000 young people in Australia that they sampled to get these statistics. So he oversaw all of this across the world. And so it was interesting to hear his insights to this issue of young people falling away from the church. Surely, okay, he's not a theologian, not a psychologist, not a, but he's a pollster. He's seen all these young people. He's even been in interviews with them. Now, what's his opinion? What does he say about this crisis in the church, about the young people falling away? And the two phrases out of his whole talk, which I took away, were this: the next generation, so he said, the next generation have questions that the church is not prepared to answer. And then he went on to issue a poignant question, which was a challenge to the church. He said this: can the church help the next generation think through the questions that they have with robust answers? Now, he didn't talk about creation. I'm pretty sure he's not a creationist. He flashed up Wikipedia page saying, look, the book of Daniel, we're confused about who wrote it and when. And I know why that is. It's because people believe in naturalism, as you were saying, Graham. And they believe that prophecy is not possible. Therefore, Daniel couldn't have predicted the many things that he predicted hundreds of years before they came about, that Cyrus would be the ruler, etc. And of course, we get biblical interpreters that agree with naturalism in their head, and therefore they change their theology to allow naturalism to be present and the miraculous prophetic gift to not be present. So anyway, the point is, I don't think he doesn't know. Pretty sure he's not a creationist. Probably he's not aware of a lot of our material, but he's come up with this. This was his challenge to the church, seeing the young people fall away. And I really think we have a lot of the answers here in these creation apologetic ministries. We really need to get the message out to the church.
So he's a Christian, Scott?
Yeah, oh yeah, he's a Christian, yeah. He's a Christian, works for the Barna Institute, and they were the two phrases that I picked up from his talk where I feel like I think he's got good insight to if we're asking, what's the problem with our young people? Why are they falling away? I would say
because the church has stopped ministering to them, because we don't talk about the questions that they have. We're not refuting the foundational poison that is being fed to them everywhere. Oh no, we don't talk about that. That's too controversial.
Yeah, it's often that. And the other point here, which I've highlighted, is with robust answers.
Robust,
Because one of the other things he said in the talk, he said, we're living in digital Babylon, he called it. He said, pastors, when you're preaching a sermon, do your young people pick up their phone and fact check you? They can do that very instantly. So they need robust answers. And so that's key as well.
Yeah, they need to know that we're giving truth.
Exactly. Yeah. And so obviously there's some Wikipedia pages, they're not going to agree with what we're saying, but we really need to be clear why we take the position that we do. We're not leaving our brain at the front door of the church and then going in. We have there's actual real good logic, there's real good reasons, and there's really good evidence for what the Bible presents to be true as true. And we want people to challenge us on that as well. So if you're on here listening and you've got some challenges, you don't believe what we believe, I really welcome you. I would love to chat and interact. Okay, so far in the presentation, we've been talking about why does it matter. I've got these other sections, and maybe you want to stop me a bit short, Graham, because we have a time limit, but I'll just tell you, I'm going to go on to how biology confirms biblical creation in a bit, and we'll talk about geology. And my summary is, what can we do as Christians, or if you're a non-Christian, what can you do given this information?
Yeah, well, if you can try and finish in about 20 minutes, so we can open up for questions.
That's cool. And then we can come back another time and go through the rest.
Yes.
So far, we've said evolution, it makes God look like the bad guy, and it turns our kids to atheism. So what can we do about this? After all, hasn't evolution been proven by science? Evolution certainly appears to have the backing of science. So it then appears that we have science versus the Bible. And this is a tough battle to fight, because science is often considered as a great authority on things of the past. It uses testable, repeatable experiments to establish facts. It's impartial and without bias. It's not held by history or religious opinion, or so we're told. And I believe we have this grand perception of science. The reason we think, well, science that tells the truth, is because of the great achievements that have been made as a result of experimental science. Experimental science has put men on the moon, developed life-saving medicines, and it's made the world's information available at the swipe of a finger. Experimental science follows the scientific method, which we talked about earlier. Theories can be tested, the results are observed, and because an independent scientist can repeat the experiment, the conclusions are verifiable. So Graham, I ask you another question. Do you drive in a car? Do you ever use a car to drive?
I'll answer that by turning the camera towards my vehicle that's sitting right there.
So did you drive? You drove to your location this morning?
Yes.
Okay, so Graham, today you've already put your life in the hands of experimental science.
Yes. this laptop that I'm using, these headphones. Well, not my life, but yes, I live
Yeah,
my
that's not
life
your
with
life.
them.
But when you stepped into that car, you put your life, because thousands of explosions per minute got you there.
Mm.
You're very confident in experimental science. And so you should be, because this experiment or internal combustion was tested many, many times before it was even used in cars. And actually, that process has occurred billions of times before, and it always gets the same result. And so we can be confident in it.
But
Go on.
Scott, I've got an objection from the side chat that we really need to deal with now. Fauci is science. That is an awesome comment. Thanks, Cheryl. Well done.
I like the two emojis. Yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
Fauci's a scientist who does science.
no, he's
really
not. He's doing politics. He's not doing science
yeah.
at all. Anyway, let's move on. Yeah. I don't want to get banned by YouTube.
That's probably true. No, I would concur with what you're saying. Yeah, I don't think.
It's like Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a scientist, but he's not doing science anymore. He's doing propaganda.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we get accused of the same thing, right?
Yes.
We're often with science communicators. But yeah, it is. I think in the world today, with coronavirus and vaccines, there is this, like, these scientists are getting very drawn in. I mean, science. The point is, scientists have an opinion. Scientists have emotions. Scientists. So there's a difference between the results and the conclusion that a scientist gives, because there can be biases and things like this. And this is why a lot of processes like peer review are important. Even in peer review, there can be biases. And we could talk about this for 20 minutes probably. But let's just quickly
deal with this phrase. But the science says, no, science doesn't say anything. Scientists say things. And
yeah, that'd be a good summary.
The science needs to be checked. Never. Don't listen to anybody who tells you to trust the science. Right? Someone who tells you to trust the science doesn't believe in science, because science says don't trust it. It says test it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. If you can do a repeatable experiment, if you do an experiment, Graham, and you've said, you know what, Scott, I've found this new theory, and this is the truth about how the world works, and you to write a paper on it, and you describe your methodology of how you did it. You there in northern Queensland and me here in southeastern Queensland, I should be able to do the same experiment that you have done. I'll follow your methodology and I'll get the same result. Now, if I don't get the same result, I will challenge you and say, I don't think you did your experiment properly, or I think you've got bias, or I think you're lying. But if I get the same result, and then someone in the UK gets the same result, then 10 years, we get the same result, we can be sure that we've found a law of nature, we would call it, or this is a valid scientific theory because it can be borne out by experiment.
Yep. Let's keep going. We've got sidetracked.
Yeah. No, it's good conversation. So what I'm comparing, I just want the audience to know this is the difference. And I know you know this, Graham, because you've followed our ministry for a long time and you're aware of this kind of material. But this is the basic thing that really shocked me when I first started learning about this, that you can separate science between, I guess it didn't shock me in that I realized when science tried to delve into the area of history, it was going beyond the bounds which really should be set for it by the experimental method. But there's another type of science, there's historical science. And this guy here that I've got on the slide, he's a paleontologist. And paleontologists look at fossils underneath the ground, and fossils that have been dug up. And he's looking at two bone fragments in this picture. So, Graham, do you know what kind of animal that is he's looking at?
No idea.
Okay. But could you give it a guess?
I don't even know what parts of the body those things are from.
Well, this is his hypothesis. Luckily,
I was going to suggest those might be teeth, but yeah. It's a little bit small on my screen.
Yeah.
Yep, that's better.
It's a bit easier when you've got bigger screen, clearer, and also a bit easier if you're a paleontologist and you've got 30 years of experience of looking at these things. So
yes,
maybe
which I don't have.
And neither do I. And so maybe we could trust this guy that he has extrapolated correctly. And you know what? His hypothesis, it seems reasonable. But would you put your life on the line for this being the truth?
No.
Because he's just extrapolated the lines. There's possibly another extrapolation that's also true of what this animal used to look like. So he's a scientist, but he's working like a crime scene investigator.
Yes.
He wasn't there at the time of the death, so he first looks at the evidence on the scene. Unfortunately for him, unlike crime scene investigators, he has no living witnesses to bring forth.
Yes.
And unlike operational science, he is unable to use the scientific method.
Yes.
There is no test that allows him or anyone else to observe if his conclusions are correct. Despite this, he decides to press on anyway, as his research grant depends upon it. So he imagines a half whale, half land mammal. Now, that might seem a bit of a stretch, and you're laughing, Graham, because it seems like a bit of a stretch to imagination, and I would laugh. I laughed too when I saw it, actually. But we didn't make this picture up. The CMI graphic artists did not draw this. This picture came from the front page of the prestigious secular journal Science. So you've got Science and Nature. So they're the two biggest journals in the world, two most prestigious scientific journals in the world. That appeared on the front page in full color, unlike this, in full color. And it was all based on 2 bone fragments and a few teeth.
Yep.
I
have seen that. I've seen that picture before. That's part of the reason that I laughed. It suddenly clicked with me where you were going with this. It's like, oh, here we go. It's just like Lucy. But Lucy, they have more evidence, but they were wrong because he pieced it together from stuff that was kilometers away from each other.
It's often like that, especially the human. So when they're trying to find transitional fossils, and the human between apes and humans, there's such a large gap that if they're trying to get the transitions, and if you can get one bone from a human, one bone from an ape, and then put them together, you've got your ape human. And that has happened in the past, and that has been called out in the past as well. Other scientists, other paleontologists, other human evolution experts have pointed out others' work and said, "Oh, you've got a human bone and an ape bone, and you've called it a mixture of the two."
So people are asking in the side chat, what did they actually find? Because I think there's a little bit of confusion because of that line drawing around the fragments. They didn't find any of that, did they? They just found the fragments. The line drawing is his theory.
Exactly.
Or hypothesis, we should call it even.
Exactly. So you've got you've got 7 teeth. Is that 7 teeth and 2 bone fragments? And so that's his hypothesis.
So the solid white bits is what he found. That's the bone fragments he found. The line drawings is his hypothesis about what those bone fragments were part of. And then the sketch off to the left is further hypothesizing, which has since been proven to be false, I believe.
Yeah, I'll just show you what else they found. So this is a bit of an old example, but there's newer examples I could show you. It's just I've got the graphics for this, so it's kind of easier to show you. So the creature was given the name Pakicetus, and that's because it was found on the coast of Pakistan, and cetus is often a word associated with whale, and so he's imagining a half land mammal, half whale. But so confident was the discoverer, Gingerek, that he wrote a publication which stated this: in time and in its morphology. Now, morphology just means shape. So in its time and its shape, Pakicetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later fully fledged whales. Now, you might be asking, why did the paleontologist imagine a half land mammal, half whale cross? Why not an ancient horse or a stray dog? Why did he think it would be that? Well, the story at the time, and still is now, and this is a picture taken from the time, is that land mammals evolved into sea mammals. So you got the real creatures in color there, and these are imaginary animals. And there's no bones for these animals here. So he's found an intermediate link. Oh my gosh. you know, that's why he's imagined a half whale, half land mammal, because finding an intermediate link is a big thing.
I like that you're using the word imagined and imagination and so forth. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what they do.
Yep, for sure. And if you're coming from that worldview, then that's got to be the case. So you must find it at some point.
Your paradigm determines how you view the world.
Yep.
Now, we've got another question. I don't know if you want to deal with it now, whether you've got another point to make. So if you can answer Nicholas's question, because it'll be difficult to come back to it later.
Did they assume that the rock held the bones and teeth in the original place, or is it possible that those fragments are for multiple specimens? Yeah, it's a good question, like what we were talking about earlier. And Graham, you mentioned that in the case of Lucy, and I think there's some other hominin specimens that the bones are like kilometers apart, and they say they're from the same, you know, and you're kind of stretching your imagination at that point, I think. But I believe in this case they were close together. Maybe they were intact. I don't know for sure. I'd have to look at it. But if you just check out creation.com, put in the search bar Pakicetus, and you should be able to find out the exact details. But I imagine they found them together. Because this is what happened 7 years after the discoverer's bold assertion of Pakicetus being perfectly intermediate. A more complete skeleton was found, and the more complete skeleton looked like this. I think you've seen this before, hey, Graham.
I'm aware of this, yes, but I didn't remember all the details.
So it was actually the guy that discovered it, Gingerek. It was his PhD student that went back 7 years. Now, I wonder whether his PhD student thought, you know what, I'm not sure about this guy's interpretation. And 7 years later, maybe he even knew there was something more. So it was his PhD student that found these bones. And now the conclusion is that Pakicetus is a past creature, of course, because we've dug up the bones, but that he looks more like this.
Yeah, so if you go back to that drawing just previous to the one you've got on the screen now, this time the line drawing, the line drawing that completes on itself is what they found, and the dotted lines are what was missing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Exactly. So it's much more complete. Obviously, there's a lot missing there, right?
But still sufficient. And sufficient to debunk this lie that he's perfectly, like he even used the word perfectly. And it's like, what arrogance based on two bone fragments that might be the jaw. And he was right that they were the jaw by the look of it. But oh boy.
Well, when it sells, doesn't it? You know, it gets you an X research grant. It puts you in the papers. You know, if you find an,
you get on the front page, and then the retraction gets published, if it gets published at all, in its tiny little thing, way deep buried in the paper, so nobody ever sees it. So people still believe in the paradigm. They still believe in the propaganda.
Yeah, and also for him as a researcher, he's propelled to that fame. He's got his position in the next university. You're not going to be demoted when your theory gets debunked. You know, that's what science is about. You put out a theory. So I'm not saying historical science is not valid. I think that's another point as well. I think historical science we can do it, but the amount of weight and emphasis my point here is we don't put our life on the line. I wouldn't even put my life on the line for this interpretation. I don't think you would either, Graham, because we don't know. We've got, you know, it's a lot better than before. And really, my point here is more data leaves less room for imagination.
You know, the only thing in history that I'll put my life on the line for is eyewitness testimony. And when it comes to the history of the universe, the history of human beings, the eyewitness testimony is God himself in his record, 66 books, although most of that isn't so much about the history. But anyway, let's keep going.
No, and it's a really good point because it's science trying to take the place of history. And so this is my point about this neatly goes on to my point about experimental science. So I'll just summarize. Experimental science is here and now science. We can test hypotheses to see if they're correct. We can do experiments over and over again and get the same answer. Whereas historical science includes beliefs and assumptions about the past. Historical science cannot be tested because it uses unrepeatable and unobservable assumptions. So the point here is there's there's differences here. Now, experimental science is like, we think of experimental science when we think about science. So what happens in the public imagination, the public's idea, in our brains, we think, this is a scientist on TV telling me about the things of the past. These same scientists have put men on the moon, developed life-saving medicines, and made the internet. These are great, amazing inventions and incredible achievements. Surely I should trust this scientist telling me what happened 5 million years ago in the middle of America. He's got this bone in his hand. He must be correct. But my point over the last few slides is that we need to hold these different types of science in a very different regard, because one of them uses the scientific method and one doesn't.
Yep. Can I just re-emphasize this slide here? I want people to understand this point, because this is the crux of the debate. Scientifically, this is the crux of the debate between, and philosophically, it's the crux of the debate between creation and evolution, essentially. And everything that creation broadly entails. So what God says about the creation of the universe, what God says about the creation of the earth, what God says about the creation of life, and what God says about the creation of man. The difference between what God says and biblical creationism and every other view, which I'm categorizing together as evolution, because all of them are an idea that we have progressed over long ages from simple to complex, whereas God says the exact opposite. Now, you may reject biological evolution, as it's oftenly called, neo-Darwinianism, or whatever other label you want to give to that idea. But you've still got the long ages, and you've still got periods of time where progress is being made, instead of God doing it instantly as he speaks in 6 days, as he says in the Bible. Both of these positions are philosophical positions. They're both religious positions. They're both spiritual positions. Where the science enters into it, and where people get this wrong. So we need to understand the difference between experimental science, which happens in the present and is observable and is repeatable, and the difference between that and historical science, where we're looking at something from the past, but we're looking at the remnants we have of it in the present. And we can experiment on the remnants that we have in the present, but we can't experiment on the past. So we're making guesses about the past based on something that we have in the present. Now, we can repeat the experiment on the thing that we have in the present, but that doesn't tell us definitively about the past, because the past isn't observable. This is an important distinction to be made that I want people to grasp clearly. Two different types of science. And in a sense, historical science, yes, it's sort of science, but it's a very different type of science. Really, it's history. It's a type of history more than it is a type of science, because science is observable, testable, and repeatable. Scott had that up before. Those are the three things: observable, testable, and repeatable. I think those were the three, were they?
Yeah.
Observable, testable, and repeatable. Can the past be tested? Can it be observed? Can it be repeated? Well, not anymore, it can't. It could have been observed, tested, and repeated when it was happening. But then in the instant that it's finished, can't be observed, tested. Well, it certainly can't be repeated. The past can never be repeated. People talk about, let's not repeat the past. Well, we're not really repeating the past. We're repeating mistakes that have been made in the past or otherwise. But we're not repeating the past. Let's take a specific example that I've heard from CMI, I think. I can't remember where I heard it. Washington crossing the Delaware. Can that be observed? No. Can it be repeated? No, he's dead. The Delaware is not the same as it was then, and the circumstances as it existed don't exist anymore. No, it can't be repeated. Can it be tested? No, only very, very indirectly. And so when people conflate experimental science with historical science, which is being done deliberately, I would suggest, not necessarily by the human actors, but definitely by the demonic forces behind them, there's a deliberate conflation of these two separate issues that are very, very different in this particular specifics. Anyway, I hope people grasp this point. Scott, if you're finished, I'd like to open up for questions.
I'll just ask you a quick question, Graham. But Washington crossing the Delaware, did it happen? And how do you know it happened?
Ah, yes, this is another very important point. How do we know that Washington crossed the Delaware? History, eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, someone wrote it down, right?
Yep.
So, yeah, someone saw
and
it.
multiple attestation from reliable sources, or at least reliable attestation from a single source that we can be absolutely confident or reasonably confident. Now, when it comes to the history that's recorded in the Bible, are we going to trust people who are living today who are just guessing at the past, really, and have an agenda, an anti-God agenda quite frequently, or frequently, and quite frankly, I conflated the two phrases. And that's admitted by people like Lyell and Hutton and even Darwin. They had an agenda that was against God. Now, Darwin claimed to believe in God, and from that perspective, he was an anti-God. But he's against what God says. He's against who God is. Was against who God is. He was against what God stands for. He was trying to defend a God who isn't the God of the Bible. And that's why he came up with his theory of evolution, because his daughter died. Suffering.
He had the same issue as the lady at the tent I was talking about.
There you go.
How can God be good if there's this terrible suffering here on this earth? So if we don't have the historicity of the Bible, if we don't know the fall was a real event and we had a good God and a good creator, a good creation before, sorry, God's still good now, but it was man's choice. It was, we're the ones with the blame. But praise God, he had a plan.
So are we going to trust the only perfectly reliable eyewitness of all of these events? And for some of these events, the only eyewitness, by the way, until day 6, there was no other eyewitness. Well, maybe the angels, but the ones who are talking to us can't be trusted. They're the third who fell. So are we going to trust the only reliable eyewitness, the only perfectly reliable eyewitness who saw the whole thing and can be trusted? Or are we going to trust scientists, so-called, who aren't really doing science in this area? They're doing history, and they're making a counterclaim to God. Let's not get confused on this, and let's not compromise God's word for the sake of false science, which is really philosophy and a false religion. Vain philosophy and a false religion. Amen. You right for me to open it up?
That's great. Yeah, let's go for it.
I'll give people the StreamYard link if they want to join.
Cool.
There's the StreamYard link, and I'll go back through some of the other comments that have been made that I wanted to bring up. So people are really appreciating that we're doing this. And we have SFT. I don't know if he's still in the house, but he's made comments as well. But the first comment I want to highlight is from Nicholas. Said that he really appreciated your let me see if I can find it. I think he was saying he appreciates your testimony, that it was really edifying. Yeah, that's it. Scott's testimony is so very edifying. This is excellent. So that was from fairly early, 16 minutes into the stream. And then Standing said g'day. Well, he didn't say g'day, but that's my abbreviation. Fantastic work, brother. Keep it up. And excited for this program. So that was 21 minutes in. So that's about when he joined, at 21 minutes in, and he was excited for what was coming up. And then we had all the echo issues, lots of comments about that. I'm just trying to see if there's any other comments I need to highlight that I didn't, because some of them started to be specific to what you were looking at, and it would have been difficult to bring them up later. So most of those I think I've already dealt with by bringing them up at the time. So if people have got any other comments, or if there's a comment that I missed that really needs to be brought up, let me know about it. Otherwise, if you want to jump on the stream, I've given you the StreamYard link. It's pinned to the head of the chat. If you've got any questions, any comments, Oh, by the way, Kevin gave the website for Creation Ministries. I don't think you did that, Scott. I was going to ask you right at the beginning, then I thought, no, he'll probably do it.
That's all right. That's good. Creation.com. There's a search bar there. I'll say something about it. There's a search bar there. So just type your question in there. It's 14,000 articles. So usually there's an article that answers the question. You just got to do a bit of digging, but it doesn't take long.
14,000. That's
Roughly
just
that.
incredible. Last I checked, like that I remember checking, was over 10,000. I think I remember there being over 11,000. It sort of got foggy after that. 14,000 articles for free. That's the free side of the website. That's just the articles. There's also media clips, both audio and video, and there's a ton of free resources. There's also a shop. You can go buy things. I encourage you to support CMI. They do excellent work. Where's the office in America, Scott?
I think it's Georgia, Atlanta.
Atlanta, Georgia.
Yeah, Atlanta,
so
Georgia,
that's Gary Bates, Jonathan Safety. Who else is in America? Because most of the listeners are America. I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, they're probably So Dr. Robert Carter.
Oh yes.
And then I think Keaton Haley, who I've worked with online before, and then I think you said you'd interviewed. Who have you interviewed? Someone.
Oh, Dr. Joel Tay. Yes, and I should say yes, Dr. Jonathan Safety, not just Jono, my friend.
Jono, yeah. Well, Jonathan's obviously a big publisher, so probably some people have read some of his books. And yeah, there's a number of them over there, and then we've got the Australian office here. So we've got offices in seven English-speaking countries worldwide.
Yes,
but we work with a lot of international organizations. There's a guy come from Hong Kong recently, and there's an organization over there we work with closely. And then there's a lot of translations. So if you go to our website and look at foreign translations, you can see other languages. Sorry, I'm just on it now. You can click other languages, and we have loads of different languages.
So in America, Spanish is pretty big, especially towards the south. And that's probably the second biggest language on creation.com as well. Because it's probably, but Chinese is growing on creation.com. There's a lot of work being done on that. Korean. There's some Romanian, because you've got Dr. Emil. And he was in Romania, but has moved to Canada. There's a lot of languages, and it's constantly growing.
Yeah. There's only one article in Hindi there, which I recently noticed because I was talking to an Indian church in Melbourne over Zoom recently. But I think we need to get some more. Obviously, that's a huge population, so we need to get some more translators. Hindi. If there's any Hindi translators out there that want to get involved, then contact us.
Yeah. So if your accent didn't give you away, your pronunciation's now giving you away. It's Melbourne, not Melbourne.
I could tell you a little story about that if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
So,
we do have to welcome Nicholas. Welcome to the stream. We'll get to you shortly.
So I grew up in the original Melbourne, where Lord and Lady Melbourne lived. There's a lake, and there's 900-year-old church, and there's the mansion that Lord and Lady Melbourne live in that have passed down the generations. So I'm fairly sure Melbourne got their name from them, but it's spelt exactly the same.
It did.
So I would say I'm correctly pronouncing it. And everyone else here in Australia is pronouncing it wrong.
Yeah, we're all wrong. Yeah, that's right. Go home, Pommy.
I'm probably not going to win the debate, because the village where I'm from, well, I say village, I guess you'd call it a town. The inhabitants was 6,000. There was 6,000 people lived there. So I think that's a bit less than Melbourne.
Yes, yeah, Melbourne. It's like Brisbane. No, Brisbane. Melbourne. We're Australians. We're lazy, and plus we can't keep our mouth open for too long. The flies get in. G'day, Nicholas.
G'day,
and welcome to Margie.
So, well, I do want to thank you, Scott, and specifically the section of. Oh, do you mind uncovering me from Alex's comment, please, brother?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. But yeah, even though I'm not on camera, I don't have my studio set up again yet. But what was I saying? Oh, specifically, the part of the testimony I found so especially edifying was when you were speaking of your um, specific discussions and the misconceptions that you used to have and all that, and how that all came together. And then I want to carry that forward and mention how that comes together to the slide that's on the screen. I'm glad it's still on the screen because I wanted to, the people who are probably going to see this are a lot of mostly people who like to do apologetics, and they do get into debates on this topic. And so I want to emphasize this distinction. But this is also good for everybody, because what was on my heart was like, not necessarily for the people who are in this specific like debate type of community that we're adjacent to on your channel, Graham, but also like the really everyday street Christians, lay people, so to speak, that this distinction between experimental science and historical science, and then having examples like this. So I don't know, Scott, if you can suggest how they can get specifically 2 more examples like this one.
Yeah. So yeah, I concur with what you're saying there, Nicholas.
Oh, and when I say examples like this one, I mean like the one on the right on the screen here. So what did they call that fictional animal?
Pakicetus.
The Pakicetus. Okay, yeah. So
Pakicetus, yeah.
Yeah, and I know that there's more good examples like that, and this distinction between historical and experimental. Then you can ask especially if it's like 2 very lay people, like, oh, do you know what the actual evidence is for that? Because when I've looked into it, historical science, sometimes it doesn't have the evidence to it like we would expect from experimental science. And like that's a very simple way to start, and to have some example that shows that.
Yeah. No, this is a good example. So Pakicetus is a good example, and there's lots others that you would say. I mean, all historical science, you could use any example, basically, that any example of any fossil, any claimed transitional species. And yeah, I would start creation.com, clicks transitional species, transitional fossils, and there's lots. We were talking about, Graham mentioned Lucy, so if in the human evolution line, so whatever kind of line you pick, so you have these phylogenetic trees where evolutionists find animals and creatures that look similar to each other, and they draw lines between them and make these phylogenetic trees. And anywhere where there's a gap where one kind of animal looks quite different to another kind of animal, then they need to try and find something in the middle, otherwise the tree is invalid. And so that's why there's this big push for finding these transitional fossils. So there's lots of examples. You could look at Rhodocetus. That's another half whale example where they found a number of the bones, and then later on they've decided this probably isn't a transitional fossil anymore. Again, and then with the human evolution line, that's probably the most fascinating. And I've got a whole separate presentation on that actually, and you can see a lot on the website again of these in-between fossils that have been proposed, of these transitional fossils that have been proposed and then later debunked. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Nicholas, that this is really important for the everyday, every believer to understand. If we're going to assess the validity of Genesis and its claim to be an historical account, then we need to understand the philosophy that underpins the science that says it's not a historical account. And key to that is understanding that actually there is a difference in what we generally term as science. And this is why this couple of slides, we haven't got very far into the presentation, but this is the first presentation that we'll give to a lot of churches. So the great thing, the great advantage, the reason I would say that we primarily focus on speaking our everyday Sunday service is exactly that fact that you were saying, Nicholas, is we want to reach all Christians with this information. And YouTube, this is a great another way, because people can share the link and it actually reaches a slightly different audience in a different way. But one of our main thrusts. We don't tend to do a lot of this. What we're usually doing is being in the church on a Sunday. So as long as the gatekeeper will let us in, as long as the pastor is on side, usually, we'd be happy to go to a pastor that's not on side by that. Even if the pastor's a theistic evolutionist, if they'd let us in the door, we'd be there, because, as you say, it's a really good point, Nicholas, that it is important to get this information to Christians, and especially, I think, new Christians that have just, maybe like me, had an encounter with God, and then their mind starts going, what about these questions? How do I answer them? And for new Christians and all Christians to understand there are answers to their questions, and we can take Genesis as history. We can take the Bible as an accurate account in everything it talks about. It's interesting. I read church statements, and you can see even in my church, the church statement of the church I go to, it says the Bible is sufficient for all daily life and conduct, or something like this. The Bible is accurate and useful for, and then it will mention a few things. But if you go back 50 years, every church would have the statement, the Bible is accurate and can be relied on in everything that it says, in everything that it claims that it says. And so even in church statements and theological college statements, you find this slight omission. It still sounds good. The Bible is accurate and can be relied on for this and this and this. But
thank you.
Actually,
Without me getting into it too much, I'll just mention that that's more my focus is actually on that side of like standards of church doctrine in such regards. So and I really appreciate that you focus on the lay people as you do, and then that you also took the time to connect to us. While this is a small audience, it's people who, it's a networking sort of set of people, you know, who are going to really do something with it. And so we need to touch base with you guys too over here. So I really appreciate it. And there's another side to people's skepticism that we have to address in apologetics. And I think it goes with something that you said, because you said you described how they need to fill the gaps in their branching of phylogeny, how they, for the audience, how they categorize the fossils to say that they're related to each other, basically. And since they need to fill the gaps, that's why there's a push for stuff like the example we have on screen here, of the historical science that you showed us. And that push, I mean, do you think it's fair to say that, like, over time, the culture has sort of developed for that, and plenty of it may develops in a subconscious or unspoken way? But I think that might be a sort of a good way to say it, that a skeptic can understand it without it sounding like a tinfoil hat theory, you know?
Sorry, say, can you say that again, that last part?
Yeah, so if you're addressing to a skeptic, because they're like, you know, the skeptic can also be skeptical that the scientists would be this dishonest, I think, is what happens. And so then mentioning that, like, because they have a need for it for their theory, it sort of develops a lot of it even in an unspoken sort of way. The pressure develops into the culture.
And I think, very good question. So so someone who's not a believer could easily say, hey, you're presenting this, but why? No way. I know some scientists, and they might not be Christian, but they're not that dishonest. They wouldn't cover things up and make things up like that. But they're not. And we, as you mentioned, and we mentioned during our conversation, was actually they're in their philosophy, their choice of presupposition forces them into that position. And it's very natural. If you think about it, if you don't think, okay, there's not a creator God, we're all accidents, then there must be this evolution of some type. Evolution is the atheist's only crutch. Like that is that before evolution came about, atheism was anti-intellectual, but atheism is their intellectual crutch. It makes them, okay, this is an intellectual idea, so if it goes, they've got nothing to stand on, so they have to defend it at all costs. now a lot of these scientists, so a lot of people that are generally, once you've done a PhD and a postdoc and you're a researcher and maybe you're teaching a bit as well, your research is very narrow. And some people that are just researchers, that are our top researchers, they're doing less teaching. So their field is so narrow that they don't tend to ask these broad-based questions, which we're talking about here. So they might never think about this type of thing. They're simply, as the man on the right here is doing, is they're looking at that fossil and they're trying to decide, what does this come from? Like, what's the best conclusion given this evidence? And you would come up with something similar. If you had the same paradigm, we would probably come up with something similar. And I cheekily mentioned maybe his research grant depended on it, and therefore he decided it was in the whale land mammal series. But maybe he did that subconsciously. Maybe it was a bit like, hey, this is what I'm trying to find, and I've actually got it. So it's hard to tell. And and this is a good point, actually, Nicholas, about this, is that a lot of people say, okay, but you've just told me all this, but there's so many clever people, very clever people, that don't believe the same thing as you're saying, and they don't believe me either. And I would say, yes, there's people far cleverer than me that do not believe this, but it's their philosophical choice, it's their presuppositional choice that they've chosen at the very start that means they're not able to see this. And they are doing very good science. And so what we're talking about, historical science, we're saying, like, he can do a chemical analysis of these bones, and that can be very accurate science. But it's the conclusions he makes about the past, which includes his assumptions. So, yeah, there's very clever people doing historical and experimental science. But
I have a very good example I think would fit really well right now for experimental science. For we'll call it for the debate. It's not for evolution or biology, but it really speaks to it because, if I'm talking to someone, I could tell them, well, you got to be careful sometimes with what people are presenting. Because I know, for instance, there's an article that I've been presented, well, actually, I haven't been presented with it, but, so it's better to have an example where you have experienced it. Now, someone has told me that this has been presented to them after the truth was uncovered and that this article still floats around, but I haven't experienced it myself, the article floating around. But that is that these lizards, a generation, they were only having fruit available to eat. And then they discovered, I guess they must have dissected them and discovered the digestive system was different. So they did an article on it saying that, they were honest in the sense that they said it's possible that this isn't what happened, and so we have to check. But the article presented that this generation was, born that way by random mutation, but it was an advantage and they kept it. So then when they did eventually test it, which I think maybe came out about 2 years later, if I remember right, but they did 15 or 16 weeks, somewhere right in there, of only feeding them fruit, ones that they knew had regular carnivorous digestive systems. And then when they checked them after 15 weeks of eating only fruit, the epigenetics, which most people in this audience will know what that means, even though obviously the layperson won't that you're talking to, but the epigenetics change their digestive system from carnivorous to have this altered, I don't remember what the organelle is called, but an additional organelle in the digestive system that made it more fit for eating fruit. So the body responded to the only fruit diet and changed. There was no evolution from one generation to the other. The lizards were always able to change from one to the other was the final conclusion. That's what, obviously, the data is only the data, but the conclusion of the data is that that's what it looks like, that it's definitely epigenetics and not natural selection as thought before. So that's a good example of experimental science. And it's a good example also because it shows like there is real experimental science, but then there's interpretation. And it kind of, hearing that example, I think, shows that. I'm not the best storyteller, so hopefully someone else giving the same example would do better. But there you go.
No, Nicholas, I get the example. Can I ask you a question? What do you reckon if we find that a lizard can quickly adapt to a different environment or a different type of food, as you were talking about, would that be evidence for a evolutionary paradigm or a biblical paradigm?
Well, I mean, by mere intuition, it seems that that's pretty fantastic that they are prepared in advance for multiple different circumstances. So that seems to incline a creator. You know, and I kind of know a lot about the topic in my mind that I'm applying to it, that someone who knows a lot less would not be able to. But it definitely implies a creator.
Yeah, for sure. And even if they didn't find that it was a pre-programmed kind of change, that it was a natural selection was able to do that change, I would say that more that stands more in favor of the biblical history, because in the biblical history we need or there is more change than in the evolutionary history. Hang on, let me qualify that a sec. So in the evolutionary history, you need quick change because you've got 14 billion years, right? Since the Big Bang, 4 billion years of Earth history, roughly. And there's, if you look up, you guys might be familiar with the waiting time problem. And the waiting time problem, Mendel first looked into this. And basically, when you do the maths on evolution, when you look at the mutations that are needed and the time that it takes to go from one generation to another for those mutations to embed themselves within a particular species that would allow them you to go from one kind of animal to another kind of animal, 14 billion years isn't enough. Like you need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions. Like the evolutionary timescale is not enough to see the changes that they need. But in the biblical history, we also need quick changes because, or we believe in quick changes because we have the different kinds of animals that were on the ark, and from there we've had all this speciation. And so when we see evidence of quick speciation, of quick digestive system changing, then that's okay. Like that's good. I mean, I'll just bring up this article on my screen here that I've looked at before, and this explains it here. So it's creation.com, speedy species surprise. And the rapid appearance today of new varieties of fish, lizards, and more defies evolutionary expectations, but fits perfectly with the Bible. So that'll explain a bit more what I was talking about there. And I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I've seen the one you're talking about with the lizards in the stomach. So there's a couple of
if in advance, where all creatures are not all necessarily, but the ones that God wants to adapt over generations, if they're built in a way that they fish for some natural selection, then that can be pretty amazing too. And if it happens much faster than randomly, of course, they're going to try to explain that as some kind of algorithm that has evolved over time or something. So the debate's always going to get deeper. But I would say that with epigenetics of all sorts, I say of all sorts because it's a multi-leveled, very deep kind of thing. I'm not prepared to express what I've learned on it, but unfortunately, but it's a really cool thing, epigenetics is. And you know, if you generalize the predictions of creationism versus the predictions of evolutionism, I guess I was anyway. If you compare the generalized predictions of each, everything that we're discovering fits better with predictions of creationism, and so now we can be pretty bold, saying that we expect, you know, more of because what they called junk DNA is literally any DNA that does not code for proteins. But we know for a fact that DNA codes for all sorts of other stuff. They're learning about it. And so that's really going to come to the surface and all that. And I'll be honest, I think some kind of supernatural like paganism is what's going to become the new main enemy rather than secularism. Because I think the science is going to come to the surface, and I think evolutionism is going to fall. I really do.
It'll turn into a
spirit. We hear about a lot now.
It'll become a spiritual evolutionism, not a naturalistic evolutionism. I think. some sort of new age. Anyway, I think you wanted to go.
Yeah, you're very
shortly.
right, Graham.
Yeah, I think you wanted to go shortly, Scott. So
yeah, that's right. I've got a Zoom. But good to be on with you, Graham, and Nicholas. Thanks for coming on as well.
Yeah, this is good discussion, and I'm really looking forward to having more of this. This is excellent. So I really appreciate you joining us, Scott, and thanks, Nicholas, for your contributions. Everyone else in the chat, thanks for everyone for joining. And I want to say g'day to Paul. I don't think I've seen you before, and sorry that you got here just at the end. But good comment. Funny how evolutionists only need a few bones to prove their theory, but tell Christians they need more manuscripts to prove the Bible. When we've got
put that one on the screen.
Overwhelming evidence. Anyway, Paul says, "When's the next one?" Not sure, Paul. Subscribe to my channel, and if you do float around this community, if you give me your email address somehow. I'd prefer you don't give it publicly for your own safety and security. But I have an email group list, so I can let you know. But as soon as we've got another program organized, it will appear on my channel as a scheduled program coming up. So I don't know how much pressure we can put on Scott now to give us a commitment to another, but it has to be run through the organization, I understand. So we'll sort that out. I'll have a chat to Laurel and we'll try to organize another one. I need to organize another one with Joel as well. It's difficult because I need to settle down, need a permanent place so that I can organize these things better. But anyway, enough rambling. I appreciate you coming on, Scott. Thanks a lot.
I appreciate being on. It's nice to talk with you.
Yeah, it was an excellent presentation. I love this sort of material, and I love, we can't talk about this enough. One just final thing that we'll give people. So the Bible tells us that God is creator, but it's not enough to know that God exists. It's not enough to know the creator. It will know that he exists, not enough to know him as creator. We need to realize that we've sinned against him. Scott mentioned this earlier. This is the reason why we have death and suffering and all of these things in the world. And he promises to rescue us from death. Jesus Christ is the way that he's done that. He came in human flesh, lived the perfect life that we cannot live, and then offered himself up as a sacrifice, the only acceptable sacrifice to God for us. And you need to trust him today. It's not good enough to say that you know that there's a God. That doesn't get you to heaven. You need to trust not only that he is, but that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And the only way to find him is through Jesus Christ. He's the way, the truth, and the life. So please trust him today.
Amen.
And if we get another show organized, we'll let you know. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll we'll let you know on the channel. Thanks, Scott.
Cool.
And we'll catch you again. We'll catch you again next time. And thanks everyone else who's joined to listen into this, and anybody who's listening to it later. I pray that there'll be many more. God bless you all.
See you later.